Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are honored to have Jeremy Lent with us as a guest presenter. Jeremy has written a book that's just coming out in July called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And John's going to put something in the chat box that will allow you to get the book early. I think you can have it as early as next week for a 20% discount. So you want to check that out. So Jeremy is also the author of The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, which we also read in the Praxis Book Club and had actually several meetings about this book. It's a seminal book, as I'm sure his new one is. And I consider Jeremy really a Renaissance man for the 21st century, or as The Guardian's George Monbiot said, quote, "He is one of the greatest thinkers of our age," unquote. So Jeremy was born in London, England, and holds a BA in English Literature from Cambridge University and a master's from the University of Chicago. He is the founder of the nonprofit Leology Institute, which is dedicated to fostering an integrated worldview that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on the earth. He also writes topical articles exploring the deeper patterns of political and cultural developments. And they are available on his website, which is www.jeremylent.com. So today he'll provide an overview of his far-reaching new book. He is a brilliant researcher, culture historian, and writer. And we are so pleased to have you with us today, Jeremy. Welcome.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Georgia, for that introduction. Obviously, I have a lot to live up to now in the next half-hour presentation. But so what I'll do is, I'll, as Georgia said, I'll take you through a presentation about the themes of the book. And then we'll have plenty of time after that for a general Q&A. So I really invite you to just store up any questions, thoughts you have to share with the whole group, or any questions for me afterwards. So without further ado, I will share my screen to begin this presentation. It looks like that's all working just fine. Well, as you can see, it's titled the same as the book, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And that's the subtitle of the book. And I guess, you might, some people might say, well, why do we need to find our place in the universe? And so I think maybe a good place to begin is actually with just our Earth, which obviously is our place in the universe. And when we look at this beautiful ball, this one place that we know of in the universe right now, where we know there is life. And life evolves on this planet billions of years ago, nearly 4 billion years ago. And just very recently, in the last couple of 100,000 years, one species arose that began to show enormous powers over the rest of life on this earth. And so, of course, we might ask ourselves, well, how have we humans done in wielding that power that we've discovered we have? And I don't need to tell anybody in this group, we've done a lousy job. There is vast ecological destruction across the board that we're all experiencing right now. Climate breakdown, of course, we're all only too familiar with, especially those of us in the West right now, with just another terrifying summer, dry period to look forward to. But all around the world, everywhere around the world, ecosystems are facing ecological collapse. There has been, hard to believe, but a 68% decline in animal populations just since 1970. It's over 2/3 of animal populations around the world disappeared in just this 50 years. And as a result of all of this, we're now entering into, unless we change our ways, the 6th great extinction of species on Earth since life began. Only this one, of course, is human caused. So, we might ask, and we should ask, how did we get to this place? what is it that's led to this incredible imbalance? And well, Georgia mentioned the book I wrote some years back called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, which looked at the different ways in which cultures made sense of the universe to take us to this place we are now. And one sort of meta theme that really came out of that book to me was that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, our values will shape the future. So it seems really critical to look at our values right now, based on the way we make sense of the world. And one thing I think is clear is that our values are based on separation, as this sort of iconic picture of life on Earth today for humans looks like. And we can go look a little bit deeper and say, what is that modern story of separation that people just take for granted as a worldview? And it looks something like this, that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature. And the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And as far as humans are concerned, really the purpose of life is, as a result of all these things, ultimately to get wealthy and powerful. This is what I traced in that old book, The Patterning Instinct. But in this new book, The Web of Meaning, what I show is that that modern story of separation is not just dangerous, but is plain false. And in the book, I show how the modern sciences, such as neuroscience, complexity science, evolutionary biology, and system sciences, point to the same core truth, the same wisdom that traditional wisdom has been pointing to for millennia, like indigenous knowledge and Taoism and Buddhism, which is the truth of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And from that, we can begin to discern a new way of making sense of things, a new story of connectedness, like that we are all interconnected in a web of meaning. So to get a sense of how this is, I'm going to take you through in this presentation, one by one, looking at the fundamental existential questions we humans ask about ourselves. And in each case, we'll see what the modern story tells us and what another alternative way of answering these questions looks like. So these questions are things like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And ultimately, why am I? And let's begin just by looking at this first one. Who am I? And well, when we think about what the modern answer is to that question, we don't really have to look further than Descartes. From the 17th century, sort of founded really the basic structure of modern philosophy with this quote that we all know, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So what he was saying and what our modern worldview has inherited is this notion that human identity exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty. And as a result, other animals that don't conceptualize like humans, and even our own bodies, are mere machines. But in fact, what biologists now understand and explain so clearly is animals are most definitely not machines. When we look at other mammals we share the earth with, elephants can communicate to each other over hundreds of miles through infrasound. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. In the oceans, we see dolphins and whales. They speak to each other in local dialects. We understand now. We know that they call each other out by name, and they'll even gossip about those who are temporarily absent from their community. We look at wolves and we see they show this deep family commitment, and we see males helping raise the young until they reach maturity. But here's the thing, even we can go beyond high functioning mammals like this, and we discover that even plants actually have a deeply networked intelligence. They have a distributed intelligence, and actually up to 20 different ways in which they sense the world around them and make sense of it. They act intentionally, purposefully. They learn. They have memories. They communicate with each other through what biologist Susan Simard has called the wood wide web of this interconnectivity under the earth through a mycorrhizal fungal network. And they use that network also to even allocate resources as a community, as a shared community. And then what's amazing is cellular biologists now, having studied the inner workings of a tiny little cell, of which we have about 40 trillion, each of us in our own bodies, have discovered that even cells display stunning intelligence. A single cell has thousands of sensors and proteins all working in harmony together. It sends and receives hundreds of signals all at the same time. It's aware of itself and others. It knows what to do. It cooperates in community with others around it. And in fact, cells will even make decisions as a group. So in our modern worldview, it's only recently that scientists are discovering this awesome intelligence in all of nature. But if we look at other cultures, if we look at traditional Chinese culture going back thousands of years, they had a deep sense of exactly that intelligence in nature. If we look at the Tao Te Ching, with the classic of Taoism, it's actually can be translated as the classic of Tao and De. And Tao, as many people know, means like the way or path, like how the forces of nature manifest in the world. But equally importantly is this word De, Te, we transliterate it, which refers to the spontaneity, the intrinsic nature that's inherent in all living things. And when the Taoists looked at all living things around them, they saw that when they acted with their de, with their intrinsic nature, they called that wu wei, or effortless action. And whether it was birds, plants, animals, they saw all non-human organisms acting in wu wei. But what happened to humans, they asked? If all of nature acts in Wu Wei, they recognize that humans act in a different kind of way in addition to that. They have called it Yu Wei, or purposive action. And they talked about it, things like using fire to dry up a well, or forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And when they looked at humans like that, they developed really a sophisticated theory of civilization, if you will, about how humans use that yu wei to lose their wu wei that they initially connected them with other creatures. Initially, they said humans belonged in a state of perfect unity with the rest of life on terms of equality with all creatures, forming one family. But then, in the words of Zhuangzi, one of the Taoist scholars, sages, they talked about how with extravagant orchestras and gesticulating ceremonies, men began to be separated from one another, basically with the rise of civilization. And here's the thing, modern neuroscience basically corroborates this Taoist theory of civilization. They show how actually our prefrontal cortex, that front of our brain that's uniquely developed in humans, is what mediates what the Taoists called our yu-wei cognition, with symbolic thought, with conceptualizing, planning, and creating abstractions. And in fact, cognitive anthropologists look back at early history, and again, just like the Taoists said, they saw that there was, with the emergence of symbolic thought, that humans developed language, culture, art, and tool making, and began to be separate from the rest of nature as they developed civilization. So now we understand, just as the Taoists did, that actually, rather than what Descartes thought, when we think of who am I, we recognize that we actually have a dual human consciousness. We have that animate consciousness that we share with all other creatures around us, that's intuitive and fast, has emotions, is effortless, that sense of what the Taoists call wu wei. And at the same time, we have what Descartes thought was our only identity, our conceptual consciousness, is analytic, rational, effortful, like yu wei. And so what that leads to is this recognition that as humans, we have this challenge to integrate both of those systems in harmony. So as a way to begin to explore the answer to that first question of who am I, we can really think of ourselves as, well, I actually am a mind-body organism that's capable of integration. So let's hold that and let's move on to this next core question of where am I? And if we begin once again with what our mainstream worldview tells us, it tells us that basically we live in a split universe where there's some sort of transcendence above, some transcendent God or whatever it might be, and a material world below. Um, and then from that, we've begun to accept that religion and science therefore must exist in different domains, and they shouldn't even speak with each other. And this allows for this unsustainable worldview where it's considered quite okay to pray to that transcendent being up there in the heavens in another dimension, even while we're ransacking nature below. But even though this is how many billions of people in the world take for granted right now, this is not how other cultures necessarily saw it. And if we look, again, going back to China, about 1,000 years ago, in the Song Dynasty in China, a really fascinating school of thought developed that they called themselves the School of the Tao. And over generations, their leading philosophers and sages integrated the three great traditions in Chinese thought of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. And we know this school of thought now, in fact, by the name Neo-Confucianism. And for these Neo-Confucianists, when they looked at the universe, they saw the entire universe consisting of what they called qi, which we can really translate simply as kind of matter and or energy, and also at the same time of li, which they described as the principles by which that qi is connected. And when they looked at the entire universe, they saw the totality of all the li, those principles of organization in the universe, as being the Tao, the way in which all things interconnect. And here's what's so fascinating, is that in modern times, in recent decades, systems sciences, such as complexity science, systems biology, chaos theory, also point to this same kind of connected universe where everything is connected in non-linear ways. And what these system scientists have begun to recognize is that in many cases, especially with self-organized systems, the interactions between things tell us more about them than the things themselves, whether it's starlings flocking in the sky or schools of fish in the ocean or the ripples of sand dunes in the desert, or even the complete weather system of Earth. And even when we look out into the ways stars in a galaxy self-organize, it's the interactions between them that are often far more important. And then system scientists and complexity scientists have begun to determine certain key principles, key Li principles, basically, of these systems that apply in different scales in all different complex systems. One of the most important of these is the universal patterns in nature that are known as fractals. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this term fractal. It refers to patterns that repeat themselves at different scales. It indicates self-organized activity, and we see it everywhere in the natural world, in coastlines, in the patterning on leaves, in lightning, the patterning in our lungs, and even in the neurons in our brains. And what is fascinating is that when system scientists look at all of life on Earth, they've begun to see that nature itself really can be understood as a fractally connected system, where each cell is a tiny fractal part according to the same fractal principles as the organism of which it's part. And organisms are part, similarly, fractally, of the largest species, and the species are part of ecosystem. And every ecosystem then is a fractal part of the living earth. So now when we begin to re-ask ourselves this question, where am I? Rather than this notion of living in this split dualistic universe, we can begin to explore this notion that actually I am part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. Now, holding these two things of who am I, where am I, we can now look a little more deeply at this question, what am I? And one of the greatest of those Neo-Confucian sages about 1,000 years ago, called Chu Shi, made this incredibly profound statement at one point saying, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. So this is a great way to explore, what am I? And when we look at our own nature, the mainstream worldview today has a pretty straightforward answer to what we are, which has been popularized so incredibly powerfully by Richard Dawkins more than almost anybody else in that book, The Selfish Gene, published in the 1970s. In his words, we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. A predominant quality to be expected, then, he says, in a successful gene is, in his words, ruthless selfishness. So from Dawkins, but from many other mainstream scientists from decades ago, from earlier times, they were discovering some of the basics of genes. We got this sense, this now become part of mainstream thinking, that the gene is the fundamental unit of evolution, that it dictates everything about the organism, and that it's inherently selfish and competitive. But in fact, in recent decades, modern biologists have shown that every one of those statements about the gene is actually false. In fact, it turns out genes are part of an iterative process with the cell, actually creating a vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity between the gene and the cell of which it's part. And in fact, the genotype itself is really more like an artist's palette. Rather than dictating what the cell or organism has to be, it's more like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. And to get a feeling for how powerful and how important that is, consider like a little creature that we all know well, like a grasshopper, a gentle, solitary creature that we see in the fields. Well, it turns out that the grasshopper is exactly the same, has exactly the same DNA as locusts, aggressive swarms that can sometimes destroy millions and millions of acres and actually will even sometimes cannibalize each other. Exactly the same DNA, but the organism, depending on its environment, switches on different genes within its DNA as needed. And far from being ruthlessly competitive, it turns out when evolutionary biologists look at how life evolved over billions of years on Earth, that the major steps in the complexity, increased complexity of life, single cells to complex cells, to multicellular life, to simple animals and to mammals, all came about as a result of increases in cooperation between different species, learning how to work together better and develop symbiosis. So it turns out that actually life evolved through cooperation. In the great words of biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And it's as a result of that that we get to enjoy the incredible rich fecundity of natural ecosystems today that live according to this key feature of symbiosis, like a harmonic dance of life, where plants photosynthesize, provide nourishment, insects pollinate, the animals transport the seeds, they fertilize, the fungus regenerates, and that mycorrhizal network transports the nutrients, as we were looking earlier. All of these activities are part of a general symbiosis that life has evolved over those billions of years. So now, leading biologists are beginning to recognize that organisms themselves are actually self-organized, fractal, dynamic patterns. In the words of one of the greatest systems biologists of the last few decades, Carl Woese, we need to understand organisms, he says, as resilient patterns in a turbulent flow, a stable, complex, dynamic organization. So now when we look at this question, what am I? Instead of understanding ourselves as machines driven by selfish genes, we can actually realize that I am, in fact, a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation along with the rest of life. And these three earliest questions now lead us to begin to look at a different view of this fundamental question: how should I live? And if we begin once again with what we know as the dominant culture's mindset, well, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy. Um, and as a result of that, in the classic words of Gordon Gekko from that movie Wall Street, greed is good. Selfish behavior by individuals is in the best interest of capitalism, of everyone, which is of course why capitalism, we're told, works so well. And even somebody like Richard Dawkins, who, to his credit, hates neoliberalism and thinks that's bad, but even he believes that what we have to do is therefore overcome our selfish genes. In his words, again, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. So we have to understand what our selfish genes are up to upset their design. So it creates this sense of this inner battle of our core selfishness and having to overcome them through imposing some kind of morality. But again, evolutionary biologists have now shown that to be absolutely false. In fact, humans evolved to be cooperative. Millions of years ago, when humans first found themselves in the savannah, when pre-human hominids found themselves in the savannah, they were vulnerable to predators. And it was those who learned to collaborate that were the most successful. And over those millions of years, as we evolved, our human identity expanded from the self and the kin to include the entire group of which we were part. So that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us from other primates. And as a result of that, we modern humans have strongly in us these deeply evolved moral emotions, as they're sometimes called. Emotions like compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, embarrassment. And as a result of all these different moral emotions that are so powerful for us humans, we don't just act morally because we think we should, but we do so because it feels right. And this is something that indigenous cultures around the world knew and lived their life and their values according to. Like in Africa, there's this great concept of Ubuntu, which is roughly translated as I am because you are, where the foundation of morality is that interconnectedness of the group identity. Here in North America, in the Lakota, we get this equally profound phrase, mitakuye Oyasin, which basically translates as we are all related. And what they're referring to when they say all is not just their own family, but all of nature, every part of nature around us. So what we learn from this is our flourishing is based on our intrinsic connectedness within ourselves, with others, with the natural world, and with the living earth. And human flourishing itself, just like we was looking at those fractal patterns, human flourishing itself is fractal, where each human mind-body organism is part of a community, which itself is part of the living earth. And probably this is best summarized by the great humanitarian from the 20th century, Albert Schweitzer, who came up with a fundamentally different life-based value system. And his statement was like this: I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as a result, in his words, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. So now as we begin to piece together this foundational question, how should I live? We begin to realize how wrong, just factually wrong, as well as morally wrong, that competitive, greed-based way of living is. And in fact, we can begin to start a value system based on this foundation. I should live in reverence and care for all life. And so now, as we're closing, let's turn to this final question that we all ask at some point: why am I? What's the purpose of our life? And if we turn again to what the mainstream reductionist world tells us, well, this is probably the most powerful answer coming from actually a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Steven Weinberg, who's a real spokesperson for this worldview of reductionism, saying that actually we live in a pointless universe. The more the universe seems comprehensible, as he writes, the more it also seems pointless. But once we start to recognize the deep connectedness of all things, as I've been describing, we get to see that meaning itself is a function of connectedness. That as the number of connections increases in any complex system, they actually lead to a phase transition and the emergence of new meaning. We see this in anything, any system we look around us. Just we know that when words connect, each word is a separate thing, but when they all connect, language emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect, consciousness emerges. And many of us have had this kind of peak experience of oneness, like this deep, profound sense at some point in our lives of this oneness of all things, which we're told by mainstream world, well, that's kind of spiritual, maybe, but it's got nothing to do with science. But actually, science is pointing the way to showing the validity of exactly that type of peak experience. And this connectedness has profound implications, which is that everything you do in your life creates those Lee ripples, which affect everything else in the universe. This principle of the ultimate connectivity of everything in the universe. Basically, we exist in an ocean of Lee, and those Lee ripples that exist within each of us, in terms of the choices we make, in terms of the choices to participate in regenerative community, in the choices to engage in a broader political process, all of those decisions that we make are what actually weave the web of meaning of which we're all part. And so as we ask this question anew, this question of why am I, we can turn away from what this mainstream society tells us, that there is no answer to that question. It's all just pointless. And actually recognize that actually for each of us, I'm here on this earth to weave my part in the web of meaning. And if enough of us do that, and enough of us begin to recognize this deep connectivity and lead our lives accordingly, then maybe we have the potential to regenerate our beautiful, fragile earth that's being so destroyed right now by this destructive civilization of separation. So that summarizes this book, The Web of Meaning. And just as Georgia was saying, the official release date is actually July 13th. But if you go to newsociety.com, and perhaps we can put again in the chat, just that link, you can actually go and buy it direct from the publisher and get a 20% discount. And they should be sending them out as soon as next week. So you shouldn't have to wait too long at all to actually read it if you're interested to do that. So let me stop the share right now. And I greatly look forward to any questions, discussion, thoughts, reflections that any of you have at this point. So.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. This was wonderful. And I took some notes. There's so much to think about. And one of the things I just wanted to bring up, I know people hear this from the other times, but when you talked about connectivity and collaboration, this was one of the reasons why we began going to the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, is to learn, how do they do this? How have they learned how to cooperate so fully in their businesses and their lives that it has changed the culture of the region, which it has done. And it has done it in a short amount of time. And that's what's impressive to me when people say, oh, it takes hundreds of years to change a culture. Well, no, it doesn't. If you've got the right intention, the right understanding, like you're talking about, of the connectivity, you can do it very quickly. And they have accomplished that. So I wanted to know if you had any comment before I just open up to questions.
I think that is a fabulous example. And I do think that that's where a lot of hope exists, that we recognize that actually changing culture is not necessarily something that has to happen over multiple generations. If that were the case, then basically it's curtains for where we're headed, because our only real hope is to see some of these deep transformations happening, and we do see them. So yeah, that'll be fine. A great thing for us to explore maybe further in this conversation.
Great. Okay, now I'm going to be looking for people to have their, I see Fran has her hand up. So I'm going to call on you, Fran. Make sure you unmute.
So Jeremy, I just want to compliment you on this presentation, which is so dense and full and yet understandable. And your illustrations are so perfect. I think, as you know, I read every word of this book. I printed out the manuscript that you sent, and I underlined and made notes and just found it endlessly rich. So I just want to thank you for this monumental work. It's phenomenal.
Well, thank you so much, Fran. And it's wonderful to see you and David here today. I just get a thrill by seeing you both, sharing this meeting. And I just want to say just my gratitude to both of you, because talking about the importance of connectivity, so much of what the connections and collaborations that you've invited me into really help to inform this book and so much of the other work that I'm focused on.
I've got to jump in here, Jeremy, add to Fran that as I was listening to you, I was just thinking, everyone in the world has got to hear this presentation that is so foundational to our current situation.
Yeah.
Agree. Agree. I think.
Thank you, David.
Ken Winston, did you want to speak? Ask a question?
Yeah, Jeremy, this was really just a congratulatory message. I just thought the presentation was just terrific from a design standpoint and a communication standpoint. It's just, you've kind of coalesced so many things I've been thinking about and can never quite get it all together. You seem to be able to put these things together in a way like nobody else. And in just this simple time frame that you did it in, it's just really, I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. And, I think just to sort of elaborate on that, this is very much my intention with this book is this sense that there are so many millions and millions of us in the world today who feel that there's something wrong with this dominant culture. And there are people who are deeply involved in trying to change something that's going on. It might be involved in working in the oceans, or like the injustices that are being done, or it might be involved in, trying to get people to shift their approaches to culture and the arts, or fighting against the damage the corporations are doing to there's so many things, but oftentimes, and there might be spiritual related too, in terms of trying to regain our sense of alienation and our sense of wholeness from the alienation we have. But so many people's understanding is somewhat constrained by what they've been focused on. And a lot of what I'm trying to offer in this book is to help those of us, millions of us, who are awake to what's wrong, but to recognize the connections with what other people elsewhere are focused on. So activists can recognize that systems biologists are actually pulling in the same direction. And spiritual seekers can recognize that those who are politically engaged are actually pulling in the same direction. And that it's only once we begin to look at those connections, it's the connections themselves, which actually will ultimately be what can empower us to transform our society, rather than just any individual project by itself.
Yeah, this is kind of the opposite of the libertarian model.
Right.
And so I wanted to go to Ewan next. You have your hand up.
Thanks, Georgia. Jeremy, I work in the area of management leadership development. And I read your book, Patterning Effect, with great attention. And you gave several examples of civilizations that had destroyed themselves through the use of resources. I think the wood was an example.
Yeah.
And it seems, one of the sort of questions we often get is, what's the definition of a leader and a manager? And the quick answer is often that the manager will be very effective at leading you through a jungle, but the leader will make sure that you're in the right jungle. And it seems like so much of society today is in the wrong jungle, if you see with the metaphor, or maybe even literally. And I was wondering if I know that we're all seeking answers. I was wondering if you had, through your studies and work, had come across insights as how can we encourage leaders to provide the leadership that we need to make the changes that we have to reset our relationship with nature?
Yes, well, thank you. I think that's a great question. And I would look at it from a couple of different ways. One is to recognize, like, what comes to my mind is this wonderful quote that I actually quote in the book by the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who said that the next Buddha will, in his view, most likely turn out to be the Sangha, which in Buddhist speak, Sangha means community. So the point is that the next leader is really the community. So when we're thinking about leadership, I think that's another way in which we can transform our thinking. There's a lot of ways in our Western dominant worldview where the leader is meant to be somebody who's up front, like, you know, the Moses taking us out of the wilderness, or the Joe Biden who's like turning things around for us from this awful nightmare, and or whoever it might be. But actually, true leadership is really what we need. The kind of true leadership to get us out of this place we're in is leadership from the grassroots. And just like if you look at an ecosystem and you ask yourself, well, what is it that makes that ecosystem healthy? Is the leader that big tree, or is it that gigantic elephant, or is it the fungal network underground? And the answer is it's all of those things doing what they do most effectively as part of this bigger system. And so what I think that can lead to is, one is, for those of us who do find ourselves in the role of sort of conventional leadership, is really turn more towards this possibility of leading not from the front, but sort of really from the middle, like being in the place to try to help to allocate the resources to those, to encourage everyone in whatever group we're in to be the leader. And as a result of that, I think another key element about the leadership we need to move us out of this quandary we're in right now is to turn to those groups that have been traditionally subordinated in the Western dominant worldview. We all know, like, if you're a white male who comes from relative wealth and is born in the global north, you are far more likely for your voice to be heard. And I recognize I'm one of those people, as are many in this group. And we know that it's so much easier for us to walk into a room, walk into a space, take charge, take control, say, here's how it should be. And I think those of us who are in those places of relative power based on our cultural imbalances, one of the most important things we can do is turn to those people who are less heard, indigenous voices, voices of women, voices of people who are Black, or people who have come from the global South and just don't get heard. And in all cases, like, give them the platform we can. And oftentimes that means actually not just giving them the platform, but helping them build the platform. And the platform might look very different to what we might have initially thought it should be based on our elite privilege. But that's the only way in which we're going to see our culture truly transform in the time that is needed.
I wanted to bring up something in relationship to what you were saying about leaders and heroes and that question, because one thing we noticed, or I did when I was looking into the history of the Dubrovnik city-state between the 1200s and the 1800s, and you go there today to the walled city that was the city, predominantly the city of the city-state, and you realize there are no statues to heroes. They didn't have these kind of leaders and heroes. It was a very different culture. And that struck me quite early on. They had one statue in there to a man who had been what they call the commoner. He wasn't one of the senators. And he became very wealthy as a merchant and left all his money to the city. So they celebrated that. And that's the only person who had a statue there. And I thought how different a culture is that doesn't seek celebrities, doesn't seek heroes, but
Mhm.
has a sense of we're in this together instead of we have to find somebody to worship. So that psychological difference, I think, is really important too. And I'd love to hear you comment on that.
I think that is absolutely right, and I think that's where we need to really build new stories of what actually people can aspire to. And I think there is something in our evolved human condition to really look to some kind of examples of people we want to follow. And so in that sense, there's nothing wrong with really emboldening and empowering those kind of people who we do want to follow. But I think that there are different stories that can arise from that. You know, one example of that, and this is kind of a strange, maybe, unless someone's actually seen it, in which case you'll probably agree it's not so strange. I was actually just looking recently, after recommendation from a friend, at the Walt Disney film Moana, which is which is like a children's animated story, and it's kind of like a hero story. But what's amazing about it is the hero is a young girl on this island, and she goes through all this stuff to sort of save her island from this destruction. But everything is framed in terms of her wanting to do it not for her own glory, but for the people that are on her island, and for this sense of community. And there are ways in which we can reform what we see as these current myths towards the kind of new myths that can actually raise up the values of community, values of those people in our society that are traditionally less heard from, and let them be the ones that we follow.
Okay, I'm looking for, does anyone else have a question or comment?
Anne did.
Anne, would you
Yeah.
like to go?
And then
Yes.
admin, SOS. I think it's Katie, I want to say. Sorry,
Okay.
I'm bad with names.
All right, and then Cheryl. Okay, so Anne, were you next?
I think so.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that beautiful vision. So my question is, how do we operationalize this? What's your theory of change? According to at least climate science, and there's all kinds of systems that are falling apart, as you said, we've got 10 to 12 years. So I am not hearing in your presentation, how is this going to happen?
Yes, thank you for raising that, and I couldn't agree more. We are in an emergency right now, and we have to transform things at a dramatic rate. And we're dealing with some incredibly difficult issues, because when we look at some of the things that actually are transforming quickly and that need to be transformed, things like shifting to renewables, for example, is an example of something that is happening relatively quickly. The problem is that those kinds of shifts are simply not enough to actually move the whole system the way we need. We have to shift things fundamentally, things like change the rules by which transnational corporations operate. And we go, well, that's not going to happen in 5 years or 10 years. And so how do we make these things happen? And I think that we can learn a lot from, again, using a systems understanding of how changes happen within complex systems. Because in every complex system, actually, what you see is they go through phase transitions, that they can be in relatively stable situations for sometimes incredibly long periods, but then something happens and the change is nonlinear. And sometimes that can be in a terrible way, such as the Amazon rainforest can go through a phase transition to go from a rainforest to scrubland, which is what we're on the threshold now if we don't change things fast enough. That also can happen with culture, in the sense that as our society begins to unravel, the very things that are causing those bonds between things that have been making meaning for people for decades, and as those things actually unravel, that offers the opportunity to change them much more rapidly from within than we might ever have thought. And I think that what we need to understand about that, again, from a systems perspective, is that when systems change, there is both a top-down and a bottom-up elements to that. So the change doesn't just happen from the top. like some sort of CEOs or politicians saying this is what needs to be done. And it doesn't just happen from the bottom of lots of people doing their thing, but it has to happen when those two things actually intersect and actually relate to each other. So in that respect, I think every one of us needs to recognize that we have to be engaged in change at all fronts. We have to look at changing the ways in which we think ourselves. We have to basically decolonize our own minds. We have to transform the way we're in community, get involved in our own individual lives in things that are more life affirming. But we cannot change. We're not going to make that happen without getting involved in the profound systems change that's needed. And I think that will only take place when we see grassroots movements such as Extinction Rebellion, or such as what Greta Thunberg started with the children's climate strike, when we see millions of people around the world, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, ultimately, maybe even billions, recognizing that the changes that have to happen are absolutely profound, and they're not going to accept the unfolding disaster that we're moving to. Now, again, you might ask, well, how can it even, is there any chance that can happen in such a short amount of time? Well, last year, by way of example, we saw how the murder of George Floyd, because of our deeply connected, internet-connected global culture that we're in right now, moved incredibly rapidly towards people around the world rising up in their own areas to say, this is the kind of injustice we're not accepting anymore. Now, we know that right now, every one of these things I'm talking to, whether Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg's climate strike, or all the protesters around George Floyd, they get pushed back down by this massive militaristic neoliberal structure that's trying to maintain a lid on things. That doesn't mean that we should give up hope in that respect. It means that we have to make those interconnections even more powerful, like each of us recognizing our part in that big and incredibly complex web that we all need to be part of. So that's my my perception on that. But if you have any perspective that you'd like to add from your perspective, I'd really like to make this more of a conversation.
Admin.
Anne, do you want to add to that?
Thank you for the invitation, and I think because time is short, that I'll just park that opportunity, and I'd be happy to pursue it with anybody.
Okay.
I think we have Cheryl next.
Yeah, actually, sorry, admin's been up for a while, but I don't know. They're labeled as admin at SOS Counseling. I don't know
That's
who.
Katie. Okay,
Katie, okay.
Katie's first, then Cheryl, then Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. Brilliant today, as always. Boy, okay. So most of us in this group probably know about the David Bohm, the physics, the Rian Eisler, the Montboyat. I mean, all of this thinking. I just finished this article, The Art of Argument by, at the British Guardian, Ian Leslie. I'm passionate about the topic of the unified field and how we can change the world. My question is, so we've had famous leaders, we've had charismatic leadership. What we haven't had is pulling out the anger and judgmental side of humanity from the roots. So my question is, and I'm a psychologist, so I work with this issue. It's one thing to have great leadership. It's one thing to write great books. It's one thing to understand microorganisms and all of this, the electron field. But how do we get this change happening from the roots? And my answer to that is each of us in this group have to be more responsible to reach out radical reaching out, and learn to be skilled in our communications. But I wonder what you think.
I agree with your assessment of that. I mean, You know, some people say that the change has to begin from within, or other people say, no, that the change has to happen out there. And again, everything my book leads to is this notion of integration, that actually the answer is yes and. Like the change is not just going to happen out there or just within, but it's in the integration of all those different layers, those fractal connections. That's where the change has to take place. And I think each of us does have a very important job to essentially look at the conditioning that our culture has done to our own minds, our own ways of thinking. And no matter how much we might think we're awake in these things, we still need to work on decolonizing our own minds. This whole white supremacy, human supremacy, this like approach to extraction and exploitation is so deeply embedded that it's a work for all of us. And part of that inner work is to express that inner work to our connections with others. And I think one of the most, and this is a challenge, this is not easy, but one of the most important things we can do is when we're out there on the front lines, engaging in trying to push back against the forces of oppression, whether it might be in a local march or like you've got some militarized police officer arresting like you or somebody you know as you're trying to stand up for something, or just a conversation with a family member, you know, that uncle or whatever who's somehow turned out to be a Trump supporter, and like you just can't stand the feelings of that. We have to overcome that sense of othering other people and that sense of separation. And we need to actually lead with love. And that doesn't mean lead with niceness and just not get involved in confrontation, but it means when we're getting engaged, it can be ferocious love, or it can be what the activist Rabbi Michael Lerner calls revolutionary love. He wrote this great book by that title. And that's a love that means loving the life that is being destroyed by this stuff and ready to stand up and fight to save that life. And it also means recognizing that the people who are doing the destroying, they're every bit as destroyed and suffering and in pain as a result of the same conditioning that those of us who are being oppressed are. And in fact, in many cases, they are probably the ones who are suffering the most, because people can't put out that kind of hatred and oppressive approaches to things and without actually having it turned inward on themselves too. So we can only imagine every one of those people was once a cooing infant just looking for love, but they got so damaged by the way in which they got raised and the culture they grew up in that they turned out creating these hard barriers in themselves. So again, that doesn't mean letting them get away with the bad stuff, but trying to reach in to that shared heart, that shared beating heart that they have, and trying to appeal to their sense of wanting to live a better life for their grandchildren and caring about beautiful things on the earth like we do.
I'd like to go to Cheryl next. Cheryl, you're mute.
There now. Okay. Yes, I agree, Jeremy. It was a beautiful, beautiful presentation. And I guess I would like to ask you, how confident do you feel at this point that the generations coming up, given the world and the challenges that they're inheriting, how confident are you about their being able to rise up to create a different worldview and a different way of responding? So obviously your presentation is very inspiring in that direction, but I just would like to ask you about the reality of how you're seeing that.
Thank you. These are the important questions we need to ask. And my answer is, I don't know. I absolutely do not know. And I don't think any of us does. And I think anybody who claims a high degree of confidence one way or the other should be looked at with suspicion. On the one hand, you have people like, some of you may be aware of the deep adaptation movement started in the UK by somebody called Jen Bendell, who talks about it's inevitable that we're heading for collapse. It just is, there's no other, let's face reality. And other people talk about green growth and saying, no, this actually can happen. We can turn things around. We don't even have to do too much about it. I wouldn't go in any of those places. We have to recognize that we live in the mystery of an incredibly complex, nonlinear system. That web of meaning that I'm describing is way beyond any of our abilities to actually truly deeply understand and absolutely to predict. We can't know. But the one thing we can know is that each of us are living organisms that are actually co-creating the future. Whatever the future is that gets done is actually the result of what each of us does, the kind of strands, if you will, that each of us weave into this web of meaning. So we know each day if we are acting in ways that may be leading, that may help to amplify the activities towards that future of flourishing or leading against it. And we know those things deep in ourselves. And all we can do is recognize that all of us is life. Each of us, we can say, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live, and just give ourselves to the mystery, put ourselves on the front lines, put ourselves in whatever it is, the place that is most meaningful to us, knowing that we have to basically give up just to any attachment to the outcome we want, but knowing we're doing it for the sake of life.
Very well put. I want to go to Steve next, and then I think it's Helen after that. Steve?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Jeremy. That was just extraordinary. That was so coherent and so pointed and pertinent to where we are right now, to the essentially the existential crisis that we're in. Which has to do with whether we go toward being pulled in by the Dawkins Descartes machinery piece, or whether we actually have heart-opening experiences where we truly experience that. And you're absolutely right. It is a fractal thing. It's happening as individuals, and if we can't awaken as individuals, then there's not that much hope for awakening collectively. This is a really important conversation. Now, my real racket is comedy. And so I have to actually bring a joke to this space. And part of being a comedian, it's pumping ironies. You know, there's an ironic contradiction that people don't get because they're basically siloed by their cultural programming and, you know, what we learn to think we believe. And so we don't recognize these ironies. And so comedian pumps irony. So I'm listening to this, and this is just extraordinary. And very early on, somebody mentioned that this is really about the unified field, that this is really about moving from the Newtonian, Descartesian kind of opposite forces to really the field, a magnetic field that we're all connected in. Now, for the last 12 years, I've been working in transpartisan politics to try to bring people together and so on in connection and understanding and conversation. So my friend and colleague, Foster Gamble, has this Thrive Network, and the entire punchline of his movie is the unified field. So right. I think it's really, really ironic that these two unified fields haven't been able to get together.
Yeah, well,
there are reasons for that.
That's interesting. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways of making sense of this deep connectivity. And one of the points I just kind of wanted to touch on as we talk about sort of this notion, sometimes people say like, we're all one. And then all these reductionists out there, or sort of people who think they're really hard-nosed, say, no, but I don't even want to be all one. I don't want to be undifferentiated. We should screw that. And if I'm hungry and that person has food, I'm not one with that person, I'm hungry. And so I think what's important, and this is something I explore in a lot of depth in the book, is this notion of integration, which we can understand as being both unity with differentiation. And we can kind of celebrate both the unity and the differentiation and recognize that the way ecosystems work, the way basically all complex systems work, even abstract systems like life or meaning, happens through actually all the different parts being celebrated and being alive and fully themselves differently, even when they are part of this incredibly deeply connected hierarchy, if you will, or system of systems. So thank you for that. Yeah.
I think one thing that you mentioned earlier that I also think is interesting to look at is or are people who claim to have all the answers, or systems that claim to have all the answers, or the truth that's more truthful than someone else's truth. You know, it's like the same old competition between religions.
Right.
It's competition between worldviews
Exactly.
and myths, so to speak. So like a new story would have to overcome this need to be better than, to know no more than, and that's very much ingrained in our culture.
It's a good point, Georgia. I think that's so true. And you know, just to reflect on that, I wouldn't want somebody to think as they see me talking about connection and the rejection of the old view, that I'm trying to set up a new dichotomy, like, oh, that was all wrong and this is what's right. Because the point is that what modern systems thinking understands is not that there's something wrong with reductionism. It's actually reductionism as a worldview is incredibly powerful. We can be grateful to reductionism for the fact we can all talk to each other over the internet, for antibiotics, for electricity, for all the things of our modern world, and for leading us out of Christian mythology in the from the Middle Ages in Europe. So the point is that where reductionists go wrong is when they say we're so successful that our reductionism explains everything in the universe. And what complexity scientists, systems biologists, and what I'm suggesting in the book is that it's yes and, that in addition to the power of that reductionist approach, there is also this complex system, interconnected approach that is as important, complementary to that reductionist idea to really understand things.
Very well put. Julie.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I've been thinking a lot about what I can do personally, because books say it starts from within. So I try to live what Thich Nhat Hanh says, with loving kindness and compassion and service and creating beauty and appreciating the world and the fact that all those animals live cooperatively. Elephants go in herds, fish swim in schools, etc. And so I'm just trying to be a better person as my part in a fractal situation. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that and for sharing that. And you know what I'd like to add about that is that I think when we're talking about this notion of the web of meaning, it is so important for us to recognize each of us has our particular part to play in it. And it's, for some people, it might be being out there in politics, or there's some sense of, they need to amplify their voice as much as possible. It's not about the amplification of the voice or anything like that. It's about the deep authenticity with which we are approaching each moment of our lives from that place of connectedness, and recognizing what we can actually bring to the world in the best possible way. And that's the question each of us needs to ask, is what is our passion? What is it that we care about in our lives that can allow us to show up with the fullest of energy in this transformation that's needed? So thank you for sharing this.
I think there was maybe a last question. John, did you want to ask something? I saw your hand up and now I don't.
Yeah, I was, I guess, just going to ask a little bit of, what's technology's place in this? You talk about restructuring organizations and corporations, and I think of some research into DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, where you have some sort of voting mechanism, and then it's all governed by code and not run by a central entity. So just your thoughts on what technology has to offer to these ideas.
Yeah, thank you. That is a really important question. And technology is obviously a huge part of our current global society and our future, if we have a long-term future to our civilization. And I think the important thing to understand about technology is there are some technologies that might naturally lead more to that decentralized connectivity. And the internet is a perfect example. There are some technologies that lead more towards a more dominant hierarchical approach to society, such as nuclear energy, for example, is a typical example of that. But most important about all technology is to recognize the context in which the technology evolves and is implemented. And there are two crucial things to recognize: that much of our technology is based on this mainstream dominant worldview of conquering nature. That rather than looking at what is it that technology can do to affirm life, to regenerate life, it asks, what can we do to get out of this natural resource or whatever, what we want to the maximum, even if it's trying to do it in a so-called sustainable way or whatever. So that's one important thing that I urge any person involved in technology to ask, is any new idea they're working on, is to ask themselves, how can I develop this for the benefit of life, not for the benefit of some human subsection within it? And then really relating to that is this recognition that even the best technologies like the internet, ultimately, if they are developed within the capitalist for-profit economic system, will inevitably lead towards further furthering of that system and further destruction of those connections and what is human well-being and natural well-being. So even something as wonderful as the internet has devolved into these horrendous situation we're in now, where things like entities like Facebook use programs to figure out how to manipulate our very hormones to kind of like eviscerate our souls and make us always on this treadmill wanting to get another little hormone sort of positive benefit from seeing the thumbs up sign on our iPhone, whatever it might be. So again, the second thing I'd urge anybody developing any technology to do is ask yourself, what kind of structure can I develop this in, which is not going to be part of that for-profit capitalist system, and not get beguiled by the argument that goes, well, if you want to scale up fast, you got to become part of the system, but don't worry, keep your values intact and it'll all turn out right. Wrong. It doesn't turn out that way. Start off from the point of view of saying, how can we build a commons-based infrastructure? How can we build a cooperative infrastructure, just like the Mondragon that Georgia knows so well? And like start from that basis, and you're much more likely to develop a technology that can truly be for the benefit of future flourishing.
Excellent. I want to go to Mike. I try to get to other people rather than go back to twice if we have other people raising their hands. So Mike, you're next.
Just very briefly, Jeremy, it was a beautiful, beautiful presentation. I know everybody enjoyed it. I was wondering if you had any thoughts particularly on what they're doing in Bhutan as a kingdom, what they're doing there in terms of conservation and just the policies there. Is that something that people are following?
Of course, one of the things that we know a lot about Bhutan, or like that they've kind of gotten to be a little bit more like the sort of poster child for, is the gross happiness index. And so over some decades, they have recognized that actually this whole GDP measurement that is used to measure how well politicians are doing around the world doesn't measure anything to do with what's for the benefit of society. It simply measures how fast we can turn the natural world and human activity into the monetized financial system. That's the only thing it measures, whether it's good, bad, and oftentimes it's for the destruction of life. So they've done a great job in exploring this different kind of index called the gross happiness index and there's other organizations around the world doing similar things. So they deserve great credit for that. And at the same time, I've heard others say, and I'm not an expert in this, but I've heard others say that there's actually a lot of ways in which even within that society, there are some deep prejudices, and actually there's been some real oppression of groups within that society that haven't had the voice, that aren't in the majority culture. So we just need to be aware, with a lot of nuance in all of these things, not to turn to any one country, any one group, any one society as being, oh, those are the ones we need to follow. But recognize we're all human. We've all got this baggage we come from our history. But to really celebrate the ways in which different groups, different societies are moving towards more positive ways of looking at things, and learn from that and apply that to our own culture.
It's a really good point, Jeremy, about learning from different cultures and different systems rather than saying one has all the answers, because
Right.
no one does. It's the collaborative process that brings these things out. I think we're getting toward our hour and a half ending. So I would like to, any final things you would like to say about what you're working, about the book, or about what you see from the conversation we've had
Oh,
today?
sure. Well, I just really would like to thank you all from my heart for this incredibly rich, profound conversation. You know, there's something wonderful speaking with a group of people that, you know, we know that I'm sure pretty much everyone in this group shares this sense, this feeling of what we're looking at, and the incredible, desperate needs we have to transform our society before it gets too late. So I would just like to say to you, for each of you, as I do, you know, just recognize that we're all holding these two incredible dichotomies. We all recognize the agony of the destruction that's taking place in the world today, and the sense of potential doom and despair of like the rate at which this agony is just only increasing, the enormity of the crimes against life going on. And to also hold the sense that none of us know that it's through our connectedness with each other, it's through our giving ourselves to life, recognizing that we're part of life, and recognizing that there's nothing better each of us can do than to just devote ourselves to doing what comes best from our own hearts, to fight for life, and which is ultimately fighting for ourselves, that larger identity, and just live into that mystery, not ignoring the terribleness, the black hole of despair, but just holding that, knowing that that's not what life wants from us. What life wants from us is to give ourselves to this future that's possible.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. This has been really an important conversation and important presentation. I want to thank you deeply for sharing this with us. You can unmute if you want to clap now, because I think we all do. We're all really excited.
Wow.
Yes, I'm going to stop the recording at this point.